Officer Reyna Voss had spent 11 years on the Caldwell Creek Police Department, a mid-sized town tucked between the Blue Ridge foothills and a stretch of farmland so flat and endless it made the sky look like a ceiling pressing down on everything beneath it. And in those 11 years, she had answered burglary calls, domestic disputes, highway accidents, and one unforgettable afternoon when a retired school teacher named Harold Fitch had called 911 because a raccoon had stolen his reading glasses off the porch railing. But nothing, not a single one of those 11 years, not a single night spent alone in her cruiser with cold coffee and the radio humming low, and the darkness pressing in around the edges of her headlights, had prepared her for the night of October 14th, the night the dispatch system logged a 911 call from a woman who had been dead for 6 months. A woman named Delia Marsh, whose case was officially closed, whose death had been ruled accidental drowning, and whose photograph still sat in a manila folder in a filing cabinet in the records room that Reyna walked past every single morning on her way to her desk. A photograph she had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize certain things that refuse to leave you alone, no matter how firmly you push them aside. Reyna was on the tail end of a double shift that October night, sitting in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on Route 9, finishing a turkey sandwich she did not particularly want, and watching the neon sign flicker in the rain-slicked asphalt reflection below it, when the call came through her radio, not as a standard dispatch, but as a direct patch from the system itself. A digitized voice logging the incoming number, and the moment Reyna heard that number, she felt something cold move through her chest, because she knew it. She had dialed it herself in the spring, when she had been quietly following up on details of Delia's death that had never quite sat right with her. Details her sergeant had told her to let go of. Details that had kept her awake more nights than she could count. And now, that number was calling the emergency line at 11:43 on a rainy Tuesday night, when the woman it belonged to was 6 feet underground in Caldwell Creek Memorial Cemetery. And Reyna set down her sandwich, turned up the radio, and listened. The call lasted 14 seconds. There was breathing, shallow and unsteady, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone terrified. And then a woman's voice, barely above a whisper, said 3 words. "He has more." And then the line went dead, and the silence that followed was so total and so absolute that Reyna sat in that parking lot for a full 30 seconds before her training kicked in and she was already pulling out of the lot and onto Route 9 with her lights cutting through the rain before she had consciously decided to move at all. She did not call it in right away, which she knew was a violation of protocol, and which she would think about later with a complicated mixture of guilt and certainty that she had been right, because she knew what would happen if she called it in. She knew Sergeant Dale Pruitt would log it as a technical anomaly, a number reassignment, a ghost in the system, and the investigation she had been quietly and unofficially conducting for the better part of 6 months would be buried even deeper than it already was. And so instead of calling it in, she drove to the address she had memorized from those spring follow-ups, the old marsh property on the far edge of Caldwell Creek, where Delia had lived alone after her divorce. A 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and a wood line behind it that backed up against a creek nobody had bothered to give a name to. And when Reyna pulled up the long gravel driveway with her lights off and coasted to a stop behind a stand of oak trees, she saw something that made every instinct she had go absolutely rigid with attention. There was a light on in the basement. A thin, rectangular glow around the edges of a window that had been boarded over from the outside, which meant the light was coming from within, which meant someone was in there, in a house that had been empty and locked and sealed as part of the closed case file since April. And Reyna sat in her darkened cruiser and made the only decision that felt possible, which was to get out of the car, put her hand on her service weapon, and walk toward that light. The grass was wet, and the rain had slowed to a mist, and the only sounds were her footsteps and the low rush of that unnamed creek somewhere in the darkness behind the tree line, and the distant highway hum of a world that had no idea what was happening here on this overgrown property at the edge of a quiet town. And Reyna moved around the perimeter of the house the way she had been trained, slow and deliberate, checking the doors, checking the windows, noting that the back door had a new padlock on it that did not match the original lock from the case photographs, which meant someone had been here after the scene was released, which meant someone with access to this property or access to those case files had made deliberate choices about this place. And that thought landed in Reyna's mind like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples out in every direction she did not yet have names for. She went in through a basement window on the east side that had a broken latch she had noted in her own private inspection of the property 2 months earlier, an inspection she had conducted on her day off without telling anyone. And when she dropped down into the basement, she understood immediately, and with a clarity so sharp it was almost physical, that she had been right all along, that Delia Marsh had not drowned accidentally, that there was a story here buried so carefully and so deliberately that it had almost stayed buried forever. Because what she found in that basement was not a body and not a weapon, but something in certain ways more damning. A wall, literally a section of drywall that had been converted into something between a workspace and a record, covered in photographs and printed documents and handwritten notes connected by red string in the way that only someone deeply organized and deeply frightened would do. And at the center of that wall was a name, circled 3 times in red ink. A name that Reyna recognized. A name that belonged to a man who sat 2 offices down from her at the Caldwell Creek Police Department. A man named Deputy Terrence Holbrook. A man who had been first on scene the night Delia's body was found in the creek. A man who had written the initial incident report. A man who had personally recommended to Sergeant Pruitt that the case be closed as accidental. Reyna stood in that basement for a long time, long enough for the mist outside to thicken back into rain and for the creek to get louder in the way creeks do when the sky decides to mean business. And she photographed everything on her personal phone with the careful, methodical focus of someone who has spent 11 years learning how to preserve evidence. And she read everything she could read in the time she had. And what she pieced together from Delia Marsh's meticulous, terrified, beautifully organized documentation was this. Delia had been a bookkeeper for 3 years at a local logistics company called Iron Gate Transport, and she had discovered, slowly and then all at once, that Iron Gate was moving more than freight through Caldwell Creek, that there were accounts within accounts, payments that moved in patterns no legitimate business required, and that the man who kept those accounts safe and those patterns invisible to law enforcement was Deputy Terrence Holbrook, who received a monthly payment routed through a shell company registered in Delaware, and that Delia had made the mistake, the fatal and brave and heartbreaking mistake, of documenting all of it before she had figured out what to do with the documentation, and someone had found out she had it. And Delia had ended up face down in an unnamed creek behind her own house, and Terrence Holbrook had been the one to find her there and write the report that made it all go away. Reyna left the basement the same way she had entered it, pulled herself back out through the window into the cold rain, walked back to her cruiser, sat in the dark with her phone in her hand, and 11 years of instinct pulling in 2 different directions. One direction was the chain of command, Pruitt, the department, the process she had sworn an oath to follow, and the other direction was the FBI field office in Roanoke, whose number she had saved in her phone 4 months ago for reasons she had not let herself fully articulate until right now. And she sat with that tension for exactly as long as she could afford to sit with it, which was about 45 seconds, and then she called Roanoke. What followed was not fast, and it was not simple, and it was not the kind of resolution that feels clean in the moment, because real justice is rarely clean in the moment. It is paperwork, and it is interviews, and it is being placed on administrative leave while an internal affairs unit combs through everything you have done and said and documented. And it is sitting in a conference room in a federal building answering the same questions from 3 different agents across 4 different sessions. And it is the specific and grinding discomfort of watching the institution you have given your professional life to look at itself in a mirror it would rather not stand in front of. And Reyna went through all of that, every piece of it, without flinching and without taking the several opportunities she was given to soften her account or walk back her documentation or characterize her unauthorized visits to the Marsh property as anything other than exactly what they were, which was a police officer who had not been able to let go of a case that deserved not to be let go of. Terrence Holbrook was arrested 8 weeks after that October night, charged with evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, accessory to homicide, and 9 counts related to his financial arrangement with Iron Gate Transport. And 3 senior members of the logistics company were indicted alongside him. And the case was covered by news outlets in 6 states. And the coverage was not particularly kind to the Caldwell Creek Police Department, which was fair, and was not particularly kind to Sergeant Dale Pruitt, who had signed off on the closed case file without asking the questions he should have asked, which was also fair, and was not particularly focused on the officer who had refused to let the truth stay underwater, which Reyna told herself she did not mind, though if she was being entirely honest, there were moments when it was a harder thing to swallow than she let on, not because she needed recognition, but because Delia Marsh deserved to have her name in those stories, deserved to have people understand that what had happened to her had not been an accident, but a choice made by someone who believed he could make choices like that and never face a reckoning. And Reyna had been the one to make sure that belief was wrong. She was reinstated to full duty 6 months after the arrest, with a formal commendation from the department that she accepted with the specific kind of quiet dignity that belongs to people who have fought for something real and know that the fight was the point, not the ceremony at the end of it. And on the morning of her first day back, she walked past the filing cabinet in the records room, and for the first time in almost 2 years, she did not stop, because Delia's folder was no longer there. It had been transferred to the federal case file where it belonged, and that absence felt like something finally completed, like a sentence that had found its period after running on far too long. And Reyna poured herself a cup of coffee that was actually warm for once, sat down at her desk, and when the radio crackled with the first call of the morning, she picked it up. Because there were still people in Caldwell Creek who needed someone to answer, and she was still the one who would answer. And that was enough. And it had always been enough. And it would always be enough.